Millionaire sees girl searching for food in the trash on Christmas Eve, and what he discovers shocks him. On Christmas Eve, a lonely millionaire is walking through the streets when he comes across a scene that changes his life forever. A 5-year-old girl, crying as she rummages through a trash bin looking for food. Without realizing it, by helping her, he begins a journey that will lead him back to the love of his life and to the truth about the family he thought he had lost forever. Subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It was Christmas Eve in New York, and while the city sparkled with lights, sounds, and festive scents, Jonathan Miller's mansion remained cloaked in silence. The 40-year-old millionaire hadn't celebrated the holiday since the disappearance of his wife, Emily, 5 years earlier. On that fateful night, her car had been found wrecked on the side of a snow-covered road, the interior marked with bloodstains and signs of impact. Police concluded she'd been in a fatal accident, yet there was no body, no trace of where she might have gone. Searches dragged on for months. Jonathan hired detectives, combed through hospitals, and even traveled in pursuit of leads, but every trail led to nothing. Since then, he had lived suspended between two worlds, one where death seemed certain but was never proven, and another where hope clung painfully to his grief. That Christmas, as in all the others since, loneliness was his only companion. The mansion, once full of life, had become a mausoleum. The grand piano in the main hall, where Emily used to sing as Jonathan played, stayed shut, gathering a thin layer of dust. The walls still displayed photos of the couple, memories he hadn't had the strength to take down but couldn't bear to look at for long. The old clock ticked away each second with painful slowness, and the emptiness of the corridors echoed in his mind like an open wound. Rising heavily from his leather armchair, Jonathan drew in a deep breath and decided to leave the house. He pulled on a heavy coat, adjusted his scarf, and stepped into the city streets. He had no destination, only the need to escape the emotional prison his mansion had become. Walking among the glowing lights felt less suffocating than battling the silence that was slowly killing him from within. Fifth Avenue was crowded with tourists and locals. The towering tree at Rockefeller Center shone in green and gold, and families gathered for photographs. Jonathan watched from a distance, feeling like a stranger in his own city. He remembered bringing Emily there, remembered her radiant smile as the lights reflected in the glass buildings. That memory forced him to swallow hard, quickening his pace to escape the sight of other people's happiness that only deepened his pain. He walked aimlessly, crossing bright blocks until the streets grew quieter. His footsteps echoed against the snow, each sound carrying the weight of 5 years of uncertainty. He could still hear the officer's words, "We found your wife's car," as though it had happened yesterday. The yellow tape fluttering around the wreck remained vivid in his mind, a scar that never healed as he wandered down a less busy street. With shuttered shops and decorated houses, Jonathan's thoughts turned darker. He wondered if Emily had somehow survived, if someone had pulled her from the wreckage that night and taken her away, or if she had simply vanished into the frozen darkness. The torment of not knowing gnawed at him daily. It was worse than confirmed death because there had been no closure, no farewell. Only a void, an unexplained absence that hung over his life like a permanent shadow. Wiping his face with his gloved hand to hold back tears, he froze when another sound reached him. It was crying. Not an ordinary cry, but the desperate sobs of a child, raw, relentless, and heartbreaking. Jonathan's pulse quickened as he turned toward the sound. Beneath the yellowish glow of a street lamp, a small girl stood in front of a metal trash bin. Her thin frame trembled in the cold, her brown hair falling in messy strands over a tear-streaked face. She looked about 5 years old, the same span of time since Emily had vanished. She wore a worn coat ripped at the elbows and threadbare gloves that barely shielded her hands. The sight was gut-wrenching, On Christmas Eve, a child scavenging through trash, not just for food, but for some invisible hope that kept her there. Jonathan stood frozen, staring, unable to believe what he was seeing. For a moment, the world around him fell away, leaving only that piercing image of abandonment and stolen innocence. Taking a steadying breath, Jonathan approached slowly. "Hey there, sweetheart. Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low but steady. The girl spun around abruptly, her tear-filled eyes catching the dim light of the lamp. Jonathan flinched. The shock was immediate. Those bright green eyes, so alive and intense, were identical to Emily's. Her delicate features, even beneath the dirt and sadness, bore an unsettling resemblance to the woman he had loved all his life. He stepped back to keep from collapsing under the weight of it. The girl retreated too, hugging herself, ready to run. Jonathan lifted his hands in peace. "You don't need to be afraid. I just want to help." The street fell into a hushed stillness, holding the air between them. Jonathan stood there, driven not by memory alone, but by something undeniable in the present, the urgent need to protect this fragile child, to offer her warmth in the coldest night of the year. Jonathan kept his breathing steady as he watched the little girl, still huddled by the trash bin. Her green eyes trembled with fear, but also with cold and hunger. He crouched slightly, keeping his distance, and extended his hand into the empty space between them without touching her. "You must be freezing, aren't you? Let's find somewhere warm," he said in a firm but gentle tone, trying to sound safe. The child bit her lip, studying him as if weighing whether to trust him or run. Her stomach answered for her, growling loudly. That was the opening Jonathan needed. He nodded toward a diner still open at the end of the street, its windows glowing, the smell of hot food spilling through the door. "How about we go there? You can have something to eat." After a tense pause, the girl took a timid step forward, as though her body gave in before her mind did. Jonathan drew in a deep breath, knowing her choice left him with a role he could no longer refuse. They stepped into the diner, a small corner spot warmed by the fryers and the steam rising from bowls of soup. The waiter gave a suspicious look at the scruffy child, but Jonathan lifted his hand and ordered calmly, "A hot soup, a sandwich, and some hot chocolate for her, please." The man obeyed, and the girl shrank into the cushioned booth, staring at the silverware as if unsure how to use it. When the food arrived, she couldn't resist. She wrapped her small hands around the bowl and drank as if it were her first meal in days. Jonathan watched in silence, his chest tightening at the sight. With each spoonful she swallowed, the questions pressed harder. Who was this child? Why did her face echo Emily so vividly? And above all, why was she alone on the streets on Christmas Eve? When she finished eating, the girl wiped her mouth with the ragged sleeve of her coat and cast him a wary glance. Jonathan offered a faint smile, trying to ease the tension. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Silence hung between them for a moment, as though she feared revealing anything. Finally, she whispered, "Grace." The name was simple but powerful, and it struck something inside him. Jonathan nodded slowly, repeating it under his breath. "Grace. Beautiful name." He leaned a little closer, unhurried, and asked, "And your mom? Where is she?" The child's eyes filled instantly with tears. "She can't be with me." He said she's sick, that she can't live at home like normal people, that she has to stay in the hospital. Jonathan's brows drew together. Her voice quivered. "Robert, he always said Mama needed medicine and that I had to obey so she wouldn't get worse." Each word sounded like it was being pulled from some painful secret. Jonathan kept his gaze steady on her, though inside he was shaking. Grace went on, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "Her name is Megan Hayes. She's always tired, always sad, but she used to hold me at night and sing me to sleep. She'd sing a strange song about the moon and the stars." Jonathan felt the blood drain from his face, It was impossible not to recognize it. "Fly Me to the Moon." It was the very song he had played on the piano for Emily the night they met at the charity ball. A lump rose in his throat, and he had to glance away to keep his emotions from showing. That song was woven into his story with Emily, something far too intimate to be a coincidence. The waiter set down the hot chocolate, and Grace clasped the mug with both hands, blowing on the steam before sipping. Jonathan used the moment of calm to study her more closely. The resemblance was undeniable. The eyes, the delicate nose, the gentle curve of her chin. She could have been mistaken for Emily at 5 years old in an old photo he still kept tucked away in a drawer. His heart pounded because none of this felt like chance. With every word, every gesture, every feature, his conviction grew stronger that this child was a living link to the past he thought he'd lost. Yet one question remained. Was his grief shaping illusions out of his longing, or was reality staring him in the face? Jonathan knew he needed proof, but he also knew he couldn't simply walk away. Leaning forward, Jonathan brought his face closer to hers and spoke firmly, leaving no room for doubt. "Grace, I promise I'll help you find your mother." Her eyes widened, as if she wasn't used to hearing promises, let alone believing in them. Jonathan placed his hands on the table, his expression unwavering. "You're not alone. We're gonna find her, no matter what anyone told you." Grace blinked several times, as though her mind was struggling to take in his words. Then, for the first time, a spark of hope flickered in her gaze. In that moment, Jonathan realized there was no turning back. He didn't know where this decision would lead him, but he knew one thing for certain. He could no longer ignore the resemblance, the clues, and most of all, the desperate need of that child sitting in front of him. Jonathan walked along the sidewalk with Grace by his side, holding tightly to her small hand that clung to him reluctantly, though she had no other choice. The night was cold, and the store windows glowed with Christmas decorations that stood in stark contrast to the child's reality. Passing a department store that was still open, he stepped inside without hesitation. He bought her a few simple outfits, pajamas, and a warm coat. Grace watched silently, stunned that someone would care enough to provide for her. When they returned to the street, she held the package close to her chest as though it were a treasure. Jonathan didn't say a word. He simply led her back to his home, where the iron gate swung open to reveal the brightly lit mansion. For the first time in years, the house would welcome someone other than him. Once inside, Grace froze in the grand hallway, her eyes wide as she stared at the vast space and the chandelier's glow. Jonathan crouched, touched her shoulder gently, and whispered, "You're safe here." He took her straight to the guest room and turned on the soft lights. The space, unused for so long, seemed to awaken in the presence of the little girl. Jonathan handed her the new clothes, showed her the bathroom, and filled the tub with warm water. Grace stepped in carefully, as if she couldn't believe the fragrant, steaming water was meant for her. While she bathed, Jonathan prepared the bed, arranging pillows and blankets with unusual care. When she emerged from the bathroom, her damp hair falling over her shoulders and her body wrapped in the fresh pajamas, she looked like a different child. The weary, hardened expression softened, revealing delicate features that made Jonathan's chest tighten with unsettling familiarity, so much like Emily that he had to look away for a moment. Grace climbed into bed, nestled against the pillow, and pulled the blanket up around her, her expression caught between distrust and relief. Jonathan tucked her in and sat quietly at the bedside until she fell asleep. Once the child was resting, he went down to the library, switched on the desk lamp, and stared at the phone. Grace's words echoed in his mind. A mother named Megan Hayes, called sick, kept away from her daughter. Jonathan drew a deep breath and dialed Thomas Reed, a private investigator known for his discretion. Speaking in a low voice, he recounted everything he had learned, leaving out the storm of emotions but sharing every crucial detail. Thomas listened without interruption, promised to check hospital records, and asked for time. Jonathan paced the length of the library in silence, battling his rising anxiety. Every minute stretched endlessly. The clock neared 3 in the morning when the phone finally rang. Jonathan snatched it up instantly, his breath shallow, as though bracing for a verdict that could change everything. Thomas spoke with the weight of someone who knew the impact of every word. "She's hospitalized, Jonathan. Checked in just a few months ago at a psychiatric facility in the city. Identified as Megan Hayes. She was brought in by a man named Robert Hayes, who presented himself as her husband and claimed he couldn't care for her at home, saying her condition had worsened. Since then, she's been listed as a chronic patient, sedated and under observation, no family on record, with only one visitor logged on the first day. That's all we've got." The blow hit Jonathan like a hammer to the chest. His muscles tightened, his heart raced. Grace's mother wasn't dead, nor had she vanished without a trace. She was alive. Right now, locked away in a room behind a white door, drugged into oblivion under a name that might never have been hers to begin with. The medical files mention amnesia and episodes of confusion. Thomas continued, flipping through the pages. But the medication protocol is far too heavy for someone her age. There are notes on lethargy, slurred speech, memory lapses, and even the attending doctor admits the constant sedation may be worsening her disorientation. No family history, no documents, no mention of a child, nothing to connect her to anyone on the outside. Robert signed the papers and disappeared. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly, fighting back the flood of images, the hollow look in Grace's eyes, the promise he had made only hours earlier, and now a real address. It was no longer just intuition. There was a concrete place, a path that had to be taken. Moving quietly down the hall, Jonathan pushed open the guest room door with care. Grace slept soundly, clutching her pillow, her breathing steady after days of uncertainty. He approached, knelt by the bed, and spoke softly, to her and to himself at once. "I promised you, sweetheart. And I'll keep my word. We're going to find your mother." He stood, switched off the light, closed the door gently, and returned to the library to send Thomas what he needed for an immediate visit to the hospital. There was no more speculation, no more doubt. There was a destination now. Jonathan knew sleep wouldn't come that night, but it no longer mattered. At dawn, he would take Grace to that clinic. Beyond those walls waited the truth, harsh, confusing, drugged, but alive. And that was enough to drive his every step forward. Jonathan arrived early at the psychiatric hospital, holding Grace's hand tightly. The gray facade of the building rose before them like an imposing barrier, heavy and indifferent. The iron gate creaked as it opened, and a cold corridor led them to the reception desk, where the smell of disinfectant was overwhelming. The little girl clung to his arm as if afraid she would be taken from him before they even began. A staff member asked them to wait a few minutes while she checked the records. Jonathan studied every detail with his heart pounding, the white-painted walls, the numbered doors, the tense silence broken only by nurses' hurried footsteps. At last, they were led to a secluded room where a doctor awaited. She opened the file and explained quietly that the patient known as Megan Hayes showed signs of confusion, memory lapses, and recurring sedation. Jonathan said nothing, only tightened his grip on Grace's hand. The door opened, and a nurse guided them into a small room lit only by a high window. Jonathan stopped in his tracks, his chest crushed by the sight before him. Seated in a chair beside the bed was Emily. Her face was pale, her hair longer and unkempt, her expression empty, as if she lived permanently in the shadows. Grace, seeing her, broke free of Jonathan's hand and ran to her, crying out "Mommy" in a loud, desperate voice. Emily raised her eyes slowly, and something flickered there. She opened her arms and pulled her daughter in tightly, burying her face in the girl's hair. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks as she clutched Grace to her chest. Jonathan stood frozen in the doorway, his throat thick, his heart racing at the sight of the woman he had believed lost forever. But when Emily's eyes lifted and landed on him, her expression changed abruptly. Terror overtook her features, and she began to tremble, hiding Grace behind her. "No, don't come near us," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "You promised you wouldn't hurt us anymore. Please." Jonathan felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. Every word struck like a knife. He stepped forward, but Grace clung to her mother, and Emily's voice rose in panic. "Don't touch us. Don't let him get close." The nurse rushed in, urging Jonathan to step back. He raised his hands, desperate, his voice shaking as he tried to explain. "Emily, it's me, Jonathan. I would never hurt you. I never wanted to." But his words couldn't pierce the wall of fear. The doctor entered, placing a hand on Jonathan's shoulder and asking him to stay calm. She explained quietly that the patient had been admitted in a fragile state, with a history of heavy medication, likely administered for years. She confuses people, blends memories. Much of what she says repeats what she was told by the man who claimed to be her husband, the doctor clarified. Jonathan covered his face with his hand, his breath uneven, struggling to resist the urge to run to her. He felt powerless, trapped between the desperate need to hold her and the fear of driving her deeper into confusion. Emily, still clutching Grace, shook her head in denial, murmuring broken words that revealed the depth of her trauma. The scene tore at the heart of everyone in the room, and Jonathan felt every second widen the gap between what he longed for and what reality allowed. He stepped back, fighting the pain, tears running freely down his face. "I won't give up," he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. The doctor spoke firmly, reinforcing the truth. "The best thing you can do right now is give her time. She needs stability, careful medical supervision to ease the medication, space to let her memories return without fear." Jonathan closed his eyes, each word striking like a blow too heavy to bear. Seeing her alive yet lost was both the greatest gift and the cruelest torture. Emily was right there, breathing, but years of silence, abuse, and drugs had created a chasm that couldn't be crossed in a single day. Leaving the room, Jonathan felt his legs nearly give out, but he refused to let despair consume him. Outside, he leaned against the cold wall and drew in a long breath, silently repeating the promise he had already made to Grace. "I won't lose you again." His heart, though torn to pieces, beat with renewed strength. The road ahead might be long and painful, but it didn't matter. He would fight hospitals, false records, twisted memories, and the imposter who had stolen Emily from his life. If necessary, he would stand at that door every day until she could look at him without fear. Because in that moment, Jonathan knew with absolute certainty, he would not rest until he brought back the woman he loved and the mother Grace deserved. Jonathan wasted no time. The moment he left the hospital that day, he began gathering the proof he had always carried in his heart. Emily was his wife. Back at home, he opened the folder he had kept since her disappearance, filled with wedding photos, their marriage certificate, and snapshots of a life shared together, travels, holidays, and intimate moments only the two of them could have known. Returning to the hospital, he placed each document before the administrators and Emily's doctor. There was no room left for doubt. Emily was not Megan Hayes, nor was she Robert's wife. She was Emily, his wife, missing for 5 long years. Embarrassed, the staff began the formal process of correcting her records and reevaluating her treatment. For Jonathan, the relief of restoring the truth was overwhelming, though the pain of seeing her condition remained. He knew proving her identity was only the first step in a long journey. With a new medical plan in place, the sedatives were gradually reduced. Week by week, the difference became visible. Emily, once frozen in her chair with vacant eyes, began responding to the world around her. Jonathan visited daily, always with Grace at his side, determined to rebuild fragments of the life they had lost. He brought roses, filling the room with the fragrance she had always loved. He had a small piano brought in, and on quiet afternoons, he sat and played the Christmas carol that had once filled their winters with warmth. Emily would close her eyes, her lips moving faintly as if trying to hum along. They were only glimpses, but they were enough to fuel Jonathan's resolve never to give up. Grace, with all the innocence of childhood, played an even greater role. She ran into her mother's arms, curled into her lap, and babbled stories as though this hospital room were the most natural home in the world. Sometimes Emily stroked her daughter's hair. Other times she wept softly, whispering words like daughter, home, love. Jonathan stood close, watching as each gesture pulled Emily a little further back into reality. He stayed strong for their sake, but alone he couldn't hold back the tears. The contrast between what they had lost and what they might still reclaim tore him apart. Yet it also filled him with a hope so fierce that he clung to it as if it were air itself. But despite the progress, one question haunted him. He thought of the detective's words of that night when everything had fallen apart. Could Grace truly be his child? Or was she Robert's? The uncertainty gnawed at him until he made a decision. With quiet determination, he requested a DNA test, explaining to the doctor that he needed the truth, not only for himself, but for Grace, so she could finally know who she was. The little girl didn't quite understand why samples were taken, but Jonathan wrapped her in his arms and whispered that it was only to prove she had a safe place, a real family. The weeks that followed were agonizing. Each visit to Emily, a mix of tenderness and gnawing anticipation for the results thought at last, the day came. Jonathan stepped into the doctor's office, his heart pounding. She opened the envelope in front of him and said, without hesitation, "The analysis confirms it. Grace is your biological daughter." The world tilted. Tears came before he could stop them, his hands covering his face as sobs broke free, not of sorrow, but of a relief so profound it felt impossible to contain. For 5 years, he had believed he had lost both his wife and any hope of a family. Now he learned not only that Emily was alive, but that the little girl who had walked beside him since that night in the diner was his own flesh and blood, the child of the love they had shared before tragedy struck. Clutching the paper with trembling hands, Jonathan returned to Emily's room. He sat at her bedside, took her hand in his, and let the tears fall freely. Grace climbed onto her mother's lap, laughing, blissfully unaware of the weight of that moment. Emily, still fragile, looked at both of them, and for an instant, clarity broke through the fog in her eyes. "Our daughter," she whispered, before confusion clouded her face again. Jonathan didn't care. That fleeting spark was enough to give him strength. He knew the road ahead would be long, but in that moment, his resolve was unshakable. He would do whatever it took to bring back the woman he loved and give their daughter the home they both deserved. The months that followed were a true test of patience and courage. Jonathan transformed the mansion into a warm, welcoming space, far from the cold silence that had haunted it since Emily's disappearance. The garden was cared for again, rows of flowers blooming, especially the roses Emily had always loved, filling the air with fragrance each morning. Grace ran between the flower beds, bringing life and laughter to a place once heavy with memories. Emily was welcomed home under medical supervision, and the first days were challenging. Memory lapses still confused her. Fear appeared in unexpected moments. But every familiar detail, the piano, the garden, the family portraits carefully restored to the walls helped piece together fragments of her identity. Jonathan remained steady, always present, reminding her with every gesture that she was no longer alone. Therapy sessions became part of their routine. Jonathan attended each one, answering Emily's questions patiently and respecting the pace of her recovery. Grace, with her childlike innocence, became the irreplaceable bridge. She told stories, brought colorful drawings, and laughed at simple things, filling the silences that could have been too painful. Emily began recognizing the sound of the piano echoing through the house at night, the songs Jonathan played so gently. Sometimes she sat beside him, her trembling hands pressing random keys, as though rediscovering herself in those notes. What had once been only vague recollections was becoming a thread connecting her lost past to the present that was slowly taking shape. Jonathan discovered new ways to love in those daily efforts. It was no longer about grand gestures, but about consistency in small acts. Being there when she woke up confused, offering an embrace when fear overtook her, listening even when her words came out scattered. Little by little, Emily began to trust again, to rest in his arms, to believe that this man was not a ghost or a threat, but a part of her life she could hold on to. Jonathan's steady presence and Grace's radiant joy were turning the house into something he once thought impossible to rebuild, a home. Every giggle from his daughter, every steadier glance from his wife, was a reminder that the fight had not been in vain. The day Emily called Jonathan by name was unforgettable. They were in the living room, Grace building towers with blocks on the rug, when Emily looked up and whispered, "Jonathan." Her voice was low but clear. He froze, his heart racing. Emily, overwhelmed, touched his face and let long-suppressed tears escape. "I remember you. Our wedding. The music." The words were broken, but powerful enough to wash away years of darkness. Jonathan embraced her tightly, his own tears flowing freely. Grace, unaware of the full weight of the moment, climbed into their arms laughing, as if it were just another game. In that instant, a once shattered family found itself whole again in a single, powerful embrace. The weeks that followed cemented the change. Emily regained more and more memories, recognizing their bedroom, personal belongings, and the places they had once shared. Nightmares still came, shadows of the past lingered, but now there were hands to hold whenever fear crept in. Jonathan and Grace stood by her, reminding her that she would never be alone again. The man who had pretended to be her husband had vanished, but true love remained, rebuilding what had been torn apart. Jonathan knew he could never recover the years they had lost, but he could build new ones, stronger and rooted in truth and devotion. By the end of that winter, the mansion once again held a complete family. Emily sat in the garden with Jonathan, watching Grace play among the roses. The sun warmed her face, and for the first time in years, her eyes reflected serenity. Jonathan held her hand and kissed it tenderly, saying nothing, only certain that nothing could tear them apart again. Emily rested her head on his shoulder and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." His voice trembled as he smiled and replied, "I never would. You are my life." And there, surrounded by a child's laughter and memories that had finally turned into hope, they understood that despite all they had lost, they had gained something greater, living proof that love can withstand time, pain, and even forgetfulness. The end. So, what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.